Hello everyone. So I will be presenting about movement disorder. I will be explaining in the broad aspect movement disorder because it's a vast topic and very difficult to cover all the aspects in a 15 minutes presentation. So broadly, I will be covering in the following manner. I will be briefly define what is movement disorder and the neural pathways involved in that, then types of movement disorder, and when we describe movement disorder, what characteristic we look for while examining movement disorder, and different kind of movement abnormalities and disease entities which are associated with that, and how we approach a case of movement disorder, and one case presentation of a Huntington disease patient, and then the references. So movement disorders are classified many ways, and one definition is that any abnormal movement is known as a movement disorder, but it does not include the definition of where movement is reduced, where there is a less movements. So the correct definition would be any neurological syndrome in which there is excess of movements, hyperkinesia, or there is a paucity of movements. So if there is a less movements, you may not see the movements, but it is still a movement disorder. I mean, like bradykinesia seen in Parkinson disease. So correct definition is excess of movements or paucity of voluntary movements. Now we come to the neural pathways, which are direct or indirect pathway. I'm sure that you might have heard about these pathways, and in your medical school or in physiology books. So direct pathway, indirect pathway, these two pathways are commonly we study and how they are involved in the Parkinson disease and Huntington disease. So I will first explain about the direct pathway and then indirect pathway. And in both pathways, the different parts of brains are actually connected in a excitatory and inhibitory innervations. So the pathway which are common in both the parts of brain which are common in both pathways are cortex, from where the innervation starts, is goes to the striatum. We know that putamen and caudate, they both are together known as a striatum. Then it goes to the globus pallidus. It has two parts, internal parts and external parts. And the internal part is involved in the direct pathway, externally in that pathway. Then comes the parts substantia nigra. It has two parts, substantia nigra pars reticulata, substantia nigra pars compacta, and they are involved in that these two pathways differently. And then thalamus is a common in both pathways. From there, the innervation goes to the cortex. So in that pathway, the cortex gives the excitatory innervation to the striatum. Striatum gives inhibitory innervation to the internal globus pallidus and substantia nigra. And from there, the inhibitory innervation goes to the thalamus. And from there, the excitatory goes to the cortex. So from it, cortex, it starts and again goes to the cortex. As you can see here, there is a 2 minus, one inhibitory and there is a second inhibitory. So if cortex stimulates the striatum will inhibit internal globus pallidus, and then internal globus pallidus will not be able to inhibit thalamus. Therefore, the thalamus will be able to stimulate cortex. So this pathway is definitely excitatory pathway. So it actually promotes the movements. You can simply remember, I in my medical school try to remember by saying that direct is direct, means go for it, movement, and indirect is you are indirectly going, so may not see the action, so it is a inhibitory pathway. So that's the way of remembering. So direct pathway is 2 minus, so that's why it is overall stimulatory pathway. Indirect pathway, in indirect pathway, it starts from the cortex, again goes to the striatum, but here the globus pallidus externally is involved and subthalamic nucleus is involved, which receives the inhibitory innervation, and then it goes again to the globus pallidus, which again gives the inhibitory to thalamus. So here you can see that there is a 2 inhibition, so it becomes a positive, but there is a extra inhibition here, extra minus here. So overall, this pathway is inhibitory pathway. So that's why I'm saying that it's difficult to remember the connections, which inhibits and which inhibits, but we can just simply remember that there is a 2 minus in the direct, so it is a overall positive, but there is a 3 minus in the indirect pathways. That's why it is overall minus. So it actually inhibits the movements. So these two pathways are actually simultaneously active. So direct pathway promotes the voluntary movements in the targeted muscle groups, and indirect pathway inhibits the movement in other muscles which do not contribute to the overall wanted movements. So it leads to a coordinated smooth movement. For example, if I am picking something with my hand, I need to flex my hand. So my biceps needs to be activated, which will be by direct pathway. But at the same time, my triceps, the externus muscles, they needs to be inhibited. So that will be by the indirect pathway. So it leads to the combination of two pathways leads to a coordinated smooth movements where the muscle necessary for action, they are stimulated, while the muscles which may disturb the desired movements, they are inhibited at the same time. Now next slide shows the how these two pathways are disturbed in the two famous diseases that we use to show the abnormality of these two pathways. So I just come to again the normal, how the cycle normally goes. Normally from cortex, the striatum is stimulated. From striatum, the globus pallidus is inhibited, and then it is not able to inhibit next, and then there are the thalamus is stimulating the cortex. So that normally goes. So movements are maintained. In the Parkinson disease, we all know that in substantia nigra pars compacta, dopaminergic neurons are degenerated. There is a deficiency of dopamine. So that's why there is a less less innervation to the striatum. That's why the striatum is not able to inhibit substantia nigra reticulata and medial globus pallidus. And therefore, because it is not inhibited, therefore it is able to inhibit the thalamus. And that's why when thalamus is inhibited, it is not able to stimulate the cortex enough. So the result is overall less motor output. So we see in the Parkinson disease bradykinesia, overall less movements. While in the Huntington disease, the abnormality lies within the striatum. And here in the striatum, D2 neurons, which are involved in the indirect pathway, they are involved. And that's why you can see here, it is not able to enough inhibit the lateral globus pallidus, and therefore it stimulates the medial globus pallidus, which therefore inhibits the thalamus, and then which therefore less inhibiting the thalamus, and overall it is more motor output. So we can see that overall movements are increased in Huntington disease, while overall movements are decreased in Parkinson disease. So as I said earlier, that it's very difficult to, remember. Once we read, we always know that we have understood, but it is very difficult to remember these pathways and how it works. So the easy way is that diet is stimulating, and when there is a lesion in that, there will be less movements, like Parkinson disease. Indirectly is always inhibiting, indirectly stopping movements. So when there is a lesion in that pathway, like in Huntington disease, there will be more movements. Like in Huntington disease, we know there is a more movements, not bradykinesia. Now I come to the types of movement disorders. As I said earlier, the movement disorders are classified broadly into two categories: hypokinetic movement disorders and hyperkinetic movement disorders. Hypokinetic movement disorders could be of hypokinesia, bradykinesia, akinesia. Basically, in hypokinesia, akinesia, there is a difference of severity. In hypokinesia, there is a decrease in the amount, amplitude of the movement, while in the akinesia, there is a severe reduction of the movements. Like you can see, if a Parkinson patient starts walking, initially they may find the freezing. So that is kind of a akinesia. They find difficulty initiating the movement. There is a severe amount of reduction in the movements. And hypokinesia in the Parkinson disease, actually, apart from their gait and mobility, walking, it can manifest in other ways as well. For example, facial movements are less. That's why their face appears mask-like. It is known as a hypomimia. And when they speak, the motor pathway of speech, that is affected. That's why the speech volume is low. Inflection in the speech maybe not be seen. You may find a bit of monotonous kind of speech. So that is seen as a hypophonia. So that is the different manifestation of hypokinesia in Parkinson disease. Bradykinesia is a slowness of movement, when the movement is slow. In Parkinson disease, we commonly ask patient to make repeated movements in fast. So that will be slow in the Parkinson patient. Types of hyperkinetic movements, there are many types like dystonia, tremors, chorea, tics, myoclonus, tardive dyskinesia. And these are different types of disorders, and they are defined in this manner. Like dystonia, it is a sustained contraction of muscle, sustained muscle spasm, which could be involving the particular group of muscles, or sometimes it may be involved the large group of muscles, generalized way. Tremors are rhythmic oscillation of agonistic antagonistic muscle. Like tremors, agonistic, antagonist, both muscles are stimulated simultaneously, and there is a rhythmic oscillation will be seen. In chorea, it is not rhythmic, it is arrhythmic. The movements will be quick, irregular, but they will appear a bit kind of semi-purposeful, like seen in the rheumatic fever patients sometimes. Tics, they are the fast, irregular movements in the same muscle group. Myoclonus, we know they are myoclonic jerks. We commonly use the word jerks for them because they're the sudden or fast movements, and they generally happen in the same body part. Tardive dyskinesia. The word tardive means slow. We say it is a tardive dyskinesia because they have slow in onset. Generally, they are seen when the antipsychotic has been used for a long period of time. There's a different guidelines. Previously, they used to say that if antipsychotic has been used for 5 years, but the recent guideline says that you can diagnose tardive dyskinesia even there is a 6 months use of antipsychotics. And we use word dyskinesia because there's a different types of movements. They are generally a combination of chorea and dystonia. What I have seen in my clinical practice in tardive dyskinesia because of antipsychotic use, most commonly affect face. Even the literature says that in the 3/4 of patient, those who have tardive dyskinesia, 75% of them have the face involvement. Half of them have the limb involvements, and 1/4 of them may have the trunk involvements. So most common site for tardive dyskinesia is face, and they are very difficult to treat and very difficult to predict which one will have that. Now, what are the characteristics? How we describe movement disorders when we examine a patient? For example, if a patient may have different kind of movement abnormality, we cannot say that we cannot say he has involuntary. We have to describe in a some way, so other person can understand what kind of movement abnormality was there. So we describe in terms of speed, amplitude, rhythmicity, whether it's a short duration, long duration, which body part is affected, whether it's a focal group of muscle affected or generalized way, whether the pattern is repetitive or variable, whether it's a flowing type of movement that is seen in the chorea, or whether it's a stereotypic movement, whether it's a simple movement or complex movement, or then we describe what are the triggering factors for those movement abnormalities, what are enhancing factors, in which posture they are more, in which posture they are less. And last thing, the voluntary inhibition. Here you might be a bit surprised why we are using the voluntary inhibition as a characteristic, because when I think of movement abnormality, when I think of movement disorder, it means that there is an involuntary movement disorder. I mean, movement disorder means involuntary. So can they be voluntary inhibited? Yes, tics can be voluntary inhibited. That's why we use voluntary inhibition. Now, how these characteristics match with the different kind of movement abnormalities? The fast movements we know that are tics, myoclonus, slow are dystonia. Large movements, Balism, hemibalism. You might have heard of this term, hemibalism. It involves the whole limb, so amplitude is very large. Small movements are tremors, tics. Rhythmic movements are tremor. Arrhythmic movements, mostly all other movements are arrhythmic, like chorea, dystonia, myoclonus. Brief are myoclonus, dystonic jerks. Myoclonus is sustained. Repetitive are stereotypy, akathisia. Continuous movements are dystonia, tremors. Intermittents are myoclonus, jerks. Flowing movements, chorea. The chorea movements, they actually affects one part of body, and when after some time they starts affecting another part, then third part, and they start with the first part again. So it looks like flowing. For example, they may affect the shoulder, then elbow, then wrist. So the movement of a choreic patient appears to be flowing type. Simple movements are myoclonic, tics and tremor. Complex movements are tics. Tics can be very complex actually. Tremors which are seen in the rest are dystonia and chorea, and tremors which are seen in posture are again tremors. Sometimes cerebellar tremors, they are seen on the action, increase on action. And some dystonias are actually activated by the actions. For example, writer's cramp. Writer's cramp, they are activated on writing, not otherwise they are seen. Now, some of the movement disorders, and particularly common in a particular disease, but some other disease actually may have more than one movement abnormalities. So when we see a movement abnormality, we see whether it's a predominant feature in that patient or it is just the associated feature. And so according to that, we actually go for in the direction of a particular disease. For example, if it is a dystonia, predominant feature, very less of other abnormalities, it is more likely to be idiopathic dystonia. If it is a chorea, no other movements, it is a benign hereditary chorea or lupus chorea. If there is a tremors and there is no other abnormality, it is more likely to be essential tremors. We know that patient of essential tremor sometimes can mimic a Parkinson disease patient, but in essential tremor patient, tremors will be the predominant feature. Other things will not be seen. Essential myoclonus will be predominant. And similarly, in the Tourette syndrome patient, tics will be the predominant things. In other disease, the same movement abnormalities may be seen, but they will not be the predominant. For example, we saw that tremors are seen in essential tremor patients, but they are also seen in Parkinson patients. But in Parkinson patient, tremors are one of the features. It's not a predominant feature. Similarly, in the Wilson disease patient. Similarly, chorea, if it is a predominant thing, no other movement abnormality, it is more likely to be lupus chorea. But along with the chorea, there is other movement abnormalities are seen. Then patient is more likely to be having the Huntington disease. Similarly, the tics is a predominant abnormality. Tics is associated one of the things with other abnormality. The neuroacanthosis is likely to be a disorder. So when we see a patient and we want to generate differentials, we have to see whether the particular movement abnormality is a predominant thing or it is just one of the associated with other type of abnormality. So how we approach a movement disorder patient, like we want to know which nervous system process is involved in that. So first we have to classify the movement disorder. As I described in previous slides, according to different characteristics, we classify the movement is a tremor, chorea, dystonia. Then family history is very important. Family history may be seen in Parkinson disease patients, in essential tremor patient, in Huntington disease patients, may not be seen in other type of patients. Birth and early developmental history, it is important. As I mentioned in the previous slide, post-anoxic patients, those who have damage in the brain at the time of birth, they may have the movement abnormalities. History of encephalitis, if it's an acquired kind of abnormality happening at the late age. Drugs, psychotropics, they are well known to cause the movement abnormality. Then comes the neurological examination, general physical examination, and definitely the laboratory investigations. So when we see a patient of movement disorder, it is important to find out which disease is causing apart from classifying the movement disorder. So first we have to identify the which predominantly movement disorder a patient has. Then what are other movement disorders patient has. Then what are the other features apart from the movement disorder patient has. For example, in a Parkinson disease patient, we know that let's assume that in a Parkinson patient, the predominant thing is bradykinesia. Other movements abnormality could be the tremors, dystonia. What are other associated features? Postural instability. So these combination then helps us in recognizing the disease. Now we move to the case presentation. This case I saw a long time back. He was a 23-year-old man. He was an accountant. He was postgraduate in commerce. He was working in a private firm as a accountant, and he had a history of suspiciousness and not able to calculate, impairment in his functioning, especially in the arithmetic calculations. And soon after the few months, he develops the hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, and then he started having the anger outburst. So he could not work. He has to leave the job, and there was a social functioning impairment as well, because he could not go out because of his suspiciousness and hallucinations. I mean, social impairment. Initially, he was treated with trifluperazine. There was no improvement. Then he was treated with risperidone, and risperidone was increased up to 8 mg per day, and that resulted in the complete improvement in psychotic symptoms. There were no suspiciousness, no hallucination. He was manageable at home. But what did not improve was his ability to work again. What did not improve was his arithmetic skills. They did not improve. He did not go back to his job. So he came to us. We examined him. We found that he has a rigidity, bradykinesia. So we thought it could be because of risperidone, because he is a patient with psychosis. He's on risperidone. So we gave the triacylphenidine to him and hope that probably these two things will improve because they are drug-induced Parkinson. And with the triacylphenidine, these two features improve. But when we examined further, we found that he has severe cognitive decline. Apart from that, in examination, we found that he has an abnormality of gait, and he also has the chorioarthrotoid movement of his trunk. These two movements may be seen in psychotic patients who are on antipsychotics, but very unlikely, especially when rigidity and bradykinesia has disappeared. They have improved rigidity and bradykinesia, but chorioarthrotoid movements and the gait abnormality did not improve even after ending the anticholinergic agents. And the cognitive decline was severe compared to the duration of illness, like 2-3 years duration of illness. So we know that in a patient on psychotropics, there can be cognitive declines, but it happens after a long-term illness. It does not happen so severely and so soon. So we had a doubt whether we are treating not a pure case of psychosis, it could be something else. And then we found a family history of mother having similar illness. But what happened? Mother, after 1 year of illness, mother actually lost. There was no trace of mother, and they lost the contact on the maternal side. That's why we do not have the history what happened on the maternal side. But on other family members like paternal side, uncle, aunts, they all did not have the similar history. But mother had similar history, but they were not sure what illness was because the patient was too young at that time. So we decided to go for the genetic testing because his rigidity bradykinesia improved, but gait did not improve and cognitive decline was too severe compared to the duration of illness. So we did not find any abnormality in hematology, biochemistry, ECG, EEG, even MRI we did not find. We did not find any abnormality in the caudate nucleus, basal ganglia, no. But we found there was in two allele, one allele has 47 repeats, another allele has 18 repeats. And to diagnose the Huntington, even in the lab report, it was mentioned more than 35 or 39 is required. So we ultimately diagnosed this patient with a Huntington disease. So this case actually came with the psychosis. Then we thought it's EPS, and ultimately it came out to be a Huntington disease patient. We were able to publish this case in a journal, ASEAN Journal of Psychiatry, and it was an interesting case which explained we should be very careful if a particular patient showing the excessive sensitivity to the antipsychotics. So that's the case for this, and these are my references. I use the Adams Victor book for making this presentation, and one YouTube video for taking the pictures of diet and diet pathway, and that's all. Thank you.